Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning to chat about new policy and advocacy challenges impacting community college student success. I'd like to introduce our president and CEO of 10,000 Degrees, Kim Azuka, who will help set the stage for our conversation. Kim?
Thank you, Sbeydeh, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second gathering of the Town Hall series that 10,000 Degrees is hosting. And we recognize that this is an extremely challenging moment for everybody, so thank you again for taking some of your very important time to be with us, to hear more about how you can get involved in helping to move critical policy forward to help our students, especially those who are being disproportionately impacted today by COVID. And we know that demand for our support is going to grow ever more given COVID. And so policy is going to be extremely important for us. And we know that it is one of the greatest levers for sustainable change. I also want to thank, we have several of our partners and supporters on the call today. Thank you for being with us and all your support, because we could not be doing this important work if it were not for you. For those of you who may not be familiar with 10,000 Degrees, we are a long-standing college success organization, and our mission has been dedicated for many, many years to creating educational equity and supporting students coming from low-income backgrounds to be able to get to and all the way through college. We're currently serving more than 10,000 students and families throughout and across 7 Bay Area counties. And we're supporting 2,200 students in college currently with our financial aid assistance and also our student support. About 60% of our students start at the 4-year and 40% are starting at community college. They are all graduating at remarkable rates compared to the national average, and they're graduating with about 85% less loan debt than the average college student. But clearly, like all of you, COVID has totally rocked our world, and it has especially deepened the inequities and is deeply impacting the lives of our students. And we know it will continue to disproportionately impact our students. Given these deepening inequities and COVID's pervasive damage on students' financial security, food and housing, mental health, and now their profound disconnection from campuses, the question for 10,000 Degrees has been, and I'm sure for all of you, is how do we continue to keep our students connected to and engaged with their education? And as demand increases, how do we continue to reach those students who need us most and provide those necessary supports? So we are so pleased today to have our partners that we've been working alongside with for many years. Our panelists here today represent organizations working at both the federal and state levels. And all of their organizations have dedicated their missions to closing the equity gap in post-secondary educational attainment by promoting affordability, accountability, and equity. Today you will hear how they're addressing the challenge on the front lines with our legislative bodies and financial systems. The National College Attainment Network is a member organization. They've had a long-standing and strong presence on Capitol Hill in DC, advocating for protections and calling on Congress today for legislation that will specifically support students who are being impacted by COVID. The Institute on College Access and Success, they are calling upon our California policymakers and advocating to create an achievable debt-free college pathway for every California resident. And you Aspire, a great community partner of ours in some of the different counties that we're working, they're advocating to transform the financial systems that impact FAFSA and work study and Pell Grants. Today, we would suggest that also the community colleges are on the front lines. They have traditionally attracted more underserved students than any higher education institution nationwide, and they are also uniquely positioned right now because they provide not only a very strong pathway, but probably the best pathway to an affordable, quality, higher education for our students, especially those who are being impacted by this pandemic. I would say, however, that the future of community colleges and its critical role in student success clearly hinges how they're going to respond and adapt to the new challenges this crisis presents. The RP group recently was supported the College Futures Foundation. In their recent report, The Gate, addresses the concerns of the stopping out rate of our community college students and the stopping out rate of those students who are never making it to the 4-year. And given COVID, we expect that that is going to worsen. And this is why 10,000 Degrees has developed. It has a very targeted program to focus and support those students who are enrolling and attending community college. The RP group has also developed a framework calling for much greater collaboration among community colleges, university partners, and also community-based organizations that can address the affordability issue and also other capacity for success around navigation of the pathways, also school life balance and support network, all extremely important factors given the COVID era. We hope today will further encourage all of us to collaborate, and it'll also bring us closer to the advocacy work that we need to be able to push forward important policies that our partners are trying to advocate for with different legislative bodies. So at this point, what I'd like to do is again to thank all of you for joining us and to introduce my colleague, Sbeydeh Viveros-Walton, who is the 10,000 Degrees Director of Government and Community Relations. Thank you so much for joining us. Sbeydeh?
Thank you, Kim. And like you, I wanted to thank our panelists for joining us in what we hope will be an ongoing conversation on policy and advocacy opportunities in the era of COVID-19. Today, we're kicking off a conversation about how to move forward student-centered higher education policy. And I think it's an understatement to say that the pandemic has drastically changed almost every aspect of our lives. But one thing, however, hasn't changed. And what hasn't changed is the incredible academic and professional potential in our rising high school seniors, college students, and newly graduated college students. It is for them that we are here today to have a dialogue on how we must meet the moment to ensure that all this potential isn't lost. Like Kim mentioned, community colleges are on the front lines, and they're uniquely positioned to help students like myself as a community college graduate to further my education and professional goals. And I'm so pleased to introduce the panel today, who are longstanding partners in the work. And to start off, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and take a minute or two to talk about the work that you and your organization does. And I will kick it off to Laura. Laura, can you kick us off with an introduction?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Szabo-Kubitz. I'm the Associate California Program Director at the Institute for College Access and Success, also known as TICAS. We are a nonprofit research, design, and advocacy organization that focuses on student-centered public policies that promote affordability, accountability, and equity in higher education. And we do this work both federally and in select states, including California. Since 2012, and created in response to the Great Recession, we have run Californians for College Affordability, which is a diverse coalition of more than 24 higher education advocacy, civil rights, social justice, student leadership, business, and workforce organizations that are united in strengthening need-based financial aid in California. In recent years, we've been closely engaged in efforts to reform the Cal Grant program to ensure all Californians with financial need, including those who are not recent high school graduates and undocumented students, have the resources they need to afford total college costs, including non-tuition expenses. And then, of course, with the advent of COVID-19, we've pivoted to focus on how we can protect students' financial aid from the devastating impacts of this pandemic. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate this morning. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for joining us. Tyler with You Aspire.
Thank you, Sbeydeh, and thank you, 10,000 Degrees, for having and inviting You Aspire to join the conversation today. Like Sbeydeh had mentioned, my name is Tyler Wu, and I'm the California Policy Director at You Aspire. Aspire is a national nonprofit college access and success organization, and we work in primarily New York, Massachusetts, and California. And our goal is pretty straightforward. It's to ensure that every student has the opportunity to go to college and through college, regardless of income. And we do that in three ways. The first is direct student advising. Last year, we advised a little over 17,000 students nationally. We also train practitioners, mainly counselors and college access providers, on how to advise the students on completing financial aid applications, on how to go to college. And so that's around 2,000 practitioners last year. And then the team that I sit on is our policy and systems change team. So really looking at what are the policies and systems that must be changed in order to make college more affordable for students, particularly low-income students and students of color. So we're super excited to be a part of this conversation today. Last week, we have student advocacy fellows who were able to meet with over 43 state and federal lawmakers. So really excited to talk a little bit more about what they talked about and the discussions around COVID-19 and protecting equity in higher education.
Looking forward to hearing the student perspective. I'd like to introduce Kim Cook, Executive Director of NCAN.
Thanks, Sbeydeh, for this invitation and opportunity to talk to our California friends. As you mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the National College Attainment Network. Our mission is to close equity gaps in post-secondary attainment. We do that in three strategic ways. The first is to support practitioners on the ground, our many members, over 500 community-based organizations, including strong members like 10,000 Degrees. So thank you for that, for all of your work on the ground for us. And then our other two strategies are around policy and advocacy, how we leverage our constituency and our student voice, and then systems change, how we work with school districts and higher education institutions to really change policies that are more supportive to our students' success. So looking forward to touching on a few of those different strategies as they relate to community college success in the COVID era.
Thank you so much. And just to note to our participants, please, we encourage you to submit questions at any time. We will be integrating the Q&A into our conversation, and we'll also have dedicated time at the end of the facilitated portion of the program to go through the Q&A and answer some of your questions. We're going to start off with, I'm sorry, just to back up, you can see the Q&As on the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and submit your questions, and we'll moderate from there. Thank you. So to kind of set the stage for the conversation, I'd like to start off with one of the most unprecedented pieces of legislation that as a country, we have, and it's the CARES Act, which was signed into law on March 27th. It is one of the largest pieces of legislation in both scope and size, and it created $14 billion in higher education emergency relief fund that goes to students amongst a slew of other higher education funding and policy provisions. But I'd like to invite Kim Cook to chat a little bit about NCAN's role in the passage of the CARES Act, and then what are your thoughts and what's in the radar in terms of implementation and fund disbursement in the future? Kim?
Sure. Well, as you can imagine, as these stimulus packages were being crafted, and there were two smaller ones before CARES happened, NCAN was very busy soliciting ideas and thoughts from our members about what our students' needs were. We found that obviously students did need the emergency aid that came out of that. We also had a number of other needs that came along programmatically, shifting to virtual advising, device and technology access, and Tyler's nodding. I don't want to take everything you're about to say, but basic needs as well, as students were taken away from food, housing, healthcare. We focused on the federal aid pieces and how the federal government could respond to this as probably the only institution that has the capacity and the funding to really respond to this in a necessary way. The Higher Education Relief Fund was a significant part of that, as you mentioned, $14 billion that went to institutions. Half of that money is for emergency aid to students. The other half is for aid to the institution to make the shift to virtual learning, or however they've decided to deliver their education and content. To give you a sense of that, the scope of that money, about $2.6 billion of those dollars went to community colleges across the country. And to give you a local example, the College of Marin received $1.3 million, so half of that, $673,000 in emergency aid for students. Where we've met some significant wrinkles is in its implementation. The department was fairly fast to give the allocation numbers, the amounts to each institution, but fairly slow and very vague on what the rules were about who was eligible and how this aid could be allocated. Many colleges were slow to draw down their funds because they had to distribute them within 30 days of being drawn down, and they felt they couldn't draw them down until they had a plan for how to distribute that aid. So this happened in mid-March. We still have students who have yet to receive emergency aid through this legislation because of slow guidance and because of trepidation among financial aid offices that they don't want to break a law or find out that a law existed after the fact. What I would really focus on today is that question around eligibility, and today is a very timely webinar for us. The secretary just clarified in what's called interim guidance that's effective yesterday that emergency aid can only go to Title IV eligible students. That doesn't mean you have to have completed a FAFSA, but you had to have been eligible to complete a FAFSA. And as many of you know, a significant number of students, particularly Daca students, are not eligible for Title IV aid, therefore are starting yesterday definitively ineligible to receive emergency aid through the CARES Act. My understanding, and others may know more than I do, is that the California Community College System has filed a lawsuit disputing this eligibility. So this is already being challenged, but the dollars are being given away, and there's a possibility you could win that lawsuit, but have no dollars left to give to make it right in the end. So we are spending a lot of our time in advocacy there. We are hearing that there is likely going to be another stimulus package coming up, likely after the July 4th recess that Congress takes. Things are pretty much on hold and just in the proposal thinking about stage right now, but that's certainly a piece that we'd like to see addressed and clarified legislatively. The House has also passed its next package. The Senate does not have a companion bill. The House package does address this eligibility question. And then we're thinking big about what's the next need. So to wrap this up, we are really focusing on a concentrated, sustained aid to students that we know is so important. We are working with others, such as TICAS and EdTrust, in a campaign to double the Pell Grant. We think this is really the way to address need-based aid to the neediest students in a program that already exists and has clear implementation and eligibility. So happy to talk more about that later. We'll be hosting a virtual advocacy week, July 20th, and I can talk about how to join that in what is going to be Double Pell Week.
Great, thank you for that. And to Tyler and Laura, did your organizations have an advocacy role in the rollout of the CARES Act or in the passage of it?
Yeah, so we were we at TICAS were very heartened that the federal government acted quickly to provide much needed funding to schools and direct emergency aid to students, along with certain protections for financial aid recipients, such as providing flexibility in how satisfactory academic progress calculations are calculated. But we did voice some very real concerns with the formula as it pertains to community colleges, because the formula for allocating the emergency dollars relies heavily on Pell receipt and full-time enrollment. This means that community colleges did not get as much funding as they likely should have. So just as an example, in California, if our California community colleges had received as much funding as our public universities, that would be about $1 billion more for our community college students. And as Kim mentioned, the interim guidance regarding Daca and undocumented students did go into effect yesterday, although one bright spot is that the lawsuit that Kim also mentioned, a judge has issued that for now, California actually can continue to provide CARES dollars to undocumented students. This, of course, is going to be appealed by the Education Department, so the end result remains to be seen. But that is, a bright spot for now. And then I'll just, one last thing I'll add is that in terms of an additional federal relief package, we're also hoping to see some fixes to the CARES Act. So right now, while many federal loans have some partial relief benefits, it doesn't extend to all borrowers. So for example, campus-held Perkins loan borrowers don't get to benefit from the CARES provision. So we'd like to see issues like that addressed. And then also, as Kim mentioned, strengthening the Pell Grant by doubling its amount.
And just to add on to Laura's comments, we're really grateful for coalitions and partners to help move forward the work at the federal level as well, to expand access to who's actually receiving CARES dollars and CARES Act funds. And we also sent over a number of recommendations around basic needs security, financial aid stability, and financial aid access as the federal government looks at the next package of relief. And then, for us, we advise students every day, and we talk to our students every day about what's happening in their lives and how the policies are affecting them in real life and on the ground. So just to give you a few snippets as to what we've been working on and our conversations with our students last week with legislators. One of our fellows was receiving $1,800 in financial aid, and when she left campus and was forced to move home, that $1,800 was taken away, and she only received $900 in CARES Act funds, right? And so when a federal, one of the staff members of one of the offices found that out, it was, I think his reaction was that wasn't supposed to happen. That's not supposed to happen. And so just knowing and understanding what's happening to students, I think is really important. And it's something that we're committed to continuing to do as the federal government looks at the next phase of relief.
Thank you for that. I also want to encourage the panelists, the participants to submit questions throughout our session. There's some questions around why double the Pell, why is that number that, and we'll get to that in the Q&A portion. So this kind of sets up the conversation around the California state budget. Which has kind of hinges on a federal stimulus bill that we're hoping, fingers crossed, will soften the blow of some deep cuts. The legislature passed a budget on June 15th, although as we all know, it was more of a placeholder as negotiations with the governor's office and the legislature are still ongoing. The governors may revise proposed deep cuts to community colleges, CSU, and UCs. And the number that the California state government is solving for is about $13.4 billion this year. And next year, the governor's office is anticipating a $40.9 billion deficit next fiscal year. California does have a rainy day account, which is about $16 billion that will help lessen the blow of these cuts. The crux of the California budget, however, hinges on the possibility of federal aid. And the legislature and the governor's office are still in negotiation about how to do the cuts, when those cuts get triggered. So I'd like to open up the conversation first on Kim Cook touched a little bit about a possible bill in July. On the federal level. Kim, can you expand a little bit about what that would look like? And then from there, we'll shift into the California conversation. So Kim, I'll hand it off to you.
Yes, we're unsure what that will look like. We do know that one of the major requests that's out there is from governors, both for their K-12 systems and their higher ed systems. I will say your numbers scare me though, because $13 billion is the totality of the allocation to higher ed in the CARES Act, which was giant and likely not to be surpassed by following legislation. So California is hoping to get the number that the whole country got in what was probably the biggest allotment of money we'll see, is very ambitious. So that number frightens me a bit when I think of it in relation to the numbers that have already been put out there. I think we might see some more in student aid. We might see some assistance to higher ed. But I'm also thinking a lot for those of you who were around for the 2008-10 recession and massive state disinvestment in higher education, particularly community college, which many states still haven't restored and come back from. So I don't want to be your pessimistic friend here, but those numbers are very frightening when we think about that request in relation to the money that the federal government has already invested for the whole country, and then the unfortunate precedent that we know from the recession and state disinvestment in higher education in general, still not being back at the levels it was pre-recession.
Thanks for that perspective. And I think for us in California, it's quite sobering to hear that. And with that in mind, to our California colleagues, what is keeping you up at night about the California budget? It is, like Kim mentioned, it's dire. So if you can share a little bit about what your organization is working on in terms of the California state budget and what keeps you up at night, I'll hand it off to Tyler.
Yeah, and I'm sure Laura can say a lot about what's happening, what's keeping her up as well. For me, what's keeping me up at night is just the potential disinvestment into the higher education system in California. I mean, like Kim had mentioned, we've seen what happened in 2008, where this really great article actually from the Century Foundation came out earlier this week that showed in California before the Great Recession, the government invested more money into community colleges, and then after invested less. But during that time, they saw an increase in the number of students going to community college. And because there was less money invested, a few things happened. One, there were less course offerings, and then two, the student to faculty ratio increased by 14%. So I think because we know that something similar happened in 2008 where there was a deficit, we can't let that happen again, and where we continue to disinvest into our education system, because at the end of the day, the population that it affects are our students, and most importantly, the students that we should be putting front and center, the low-income students and students of color. And I truly believe that even in this time of looking at budget cuts, we need to double down on our students, double down on equity, and specifically in this time, racial equity, and really looking at how do we support our students of color, particularly our Black students during this time. So I really do think that is what we should be putting front and center, and that's what keeps me up at night.
Laura, now you're up all night thinking about this. You have your coffee.
Indeed. Well, as Tyler just said, disinvestment in higher education and the impacts that it has on students, in particular, our lowest income students and our students of color, in terms of costs, diminished course offerings, and diminished student services that could result. We also know that during the Great Recession, the California community colleges had to turn away about 500,000 students, which, we of course wouldn't want to see happen again. As you mentioned, Sbeydeh, the legislative budget passed on Monday is a placeholder. There will likely be continued opportunity to weigh in, both as the legislature continues to negotiate with the governor, as well as we keep hearing about an August revise. Folks may be familiar with the May revise when the governor comes out with his or her revision to the January budget proposal, but because taxes have now been delayed to mid-July, there will likely be some more revisions later this summer. And I'll also just add that, obviously very concerning about the proposed cuts to higher education as essentially 10% across the board in the governor's May revise. I will note, though, that we were grateful that the Cal Grant program was protected in the May revise, and the legislature also has continued to protect it. But I do want to flag that at TICAS, we have recommendations to help protect state Cal Grants that we think need to be implemented right now. So just as an example, and I'd be happy to talk more about it later if it makes sense, there are provisions in the CARES Act, for example, around Pell Grants, where if a student has to drop out due to COVID-19 reasons, then they don't have to refund Pell Grant dollars they may have received. So we want to see a parallel provision for Cal Grants as an example.
Thank you for that. And we have a great question on the Q&A that kind of helps us move to the next topic and still is relevant to the California budget. And it's around these equity guardrails and cuts. The question here is, how do we expand our advocacy to find additional funding systems for higher education by supporting racial equity initiatives? How do we think about some equity guardrails and proposed cuts so that the cuts are not across the board, but rather it's more of a scalpel approach? Do the panel have anything to respond to this question?
I can jump in here by saying one sunnier thing. You never would have imagined that the Congress could have come up with $2 trillion for anything before CARES, right? So when we were there in January and February and thinking about what appropriations would look like before we knew what was coming and what was about to hit us, I feel like there were a lot of nickel and dimed moments around, a Pell increase might be $100, but we can't talk about more than that because the budget's tight. And then, disaster hits and we find $2 trillion. So I think, this is in some ways magic money. We hear jokes about we're just printing money, but when there is enough of a demand and a need and advocates for it, great things happen. CARES Act is over $2 trillion in total, and that did happen. So I think we have a lot on this equity piece to make the argument about the needs to come up with these kind of historic numbers. We know how much, basically sometimes in equity, we have to talk about it from another direction to get to the equity that we want, and that's often about jobs. So we're talking about jobs, right? We know how the economy just fell out. We know recovery will be long. We've heard recession officially started. That scares policymakers. We also know from 2008 that over 85% of the jobs in recovery require post-secondary education. That's the message we need to be telling. I think that gets us to the equity we want. There are many who will listen to equity for equity's sake, and I appreciate them more and more every day. Sometimes we have to get to equity with a different message. Even though our intention is equity, we have to carry a different message to get to that same intent.
Any reactions from our California partners?
Yeah, I would say that just to echo, higher education and the ability of our students to pay for it is not only an ethical issue, but it's also integral to our economic recovery. And I think that in terms of continued advocacy, combining both student voices and data will be critical, especially in terms of highlighting where there are the most serious equity problems. So just to give an example, we have partnered in the past couple of years with the UC Student Association and the CSU, or the Cal State Student Association, to look at the disproportionate impacts of student debt on low-income students and students of color. So for example, while at UC and CSU, about half of all BA graduates have incurred student debt, the figure is, I believe, 3/4 of Black graduates at CSU and 2/3 of Black graduates at UC. So we're seeing that our students of color and our low-income students are carrying heavier debt burdens, underscoring really the need for greater investment in financial aid. And in terms of the student voice, it's so important that we can elevate what stories that students want to share. So actually, I'm happy to circulate a link later. We have a Join the Conversation platform on our TICAS website where we're asking students to either upload videos or stories sharing how COVID-19 is impacting them and how what they need to support their success.
So on real quickly to that too. I mean, I agree both wholeheartedly with Laura and Kim around just advocating for the increased investment into our education system and ways in the same ways to do that. I also think there are opportunities to promote equity and specifically racial equity that aren't necessarily big dollar items. So we have a report coming out next week around, indirect expense estimates and how they're calculated and communicated to students. I think working on the transparency and simplification of our financial aid to students and communicating that to them is a great opportunity to, one, communicate how much college costs, but then two, give students the full idea of how much college will cost if they do decide to go. And I do think there are other opportunities in California specifically. I know, our partners at EdTrust West are really leading an effort around overturning the ban on affirmative action here in California. ACA 5, which is being voted by the Senate today. So I think opportunities like that are also great ways to really advocate for racial equity that don't necessarily cost an absurd amount of money.
And just to kind of go off of that train of thought, what are some of the advocacy opportunities that we can work together on? A lot of service providers don't have a policy director or a policy dedicated person that can help track all of the moving parts at the federal and at the state, and even what's happening in their own higher ed institutions locally. The question that I'd like to pose to the panel is, what are some policy advocacy engagement? I know NCAN works deeply with organizations throughout the country and how to build this capacity. Kim, do you have any thoughts on how nonprofit service providers can engage in this policy and advocacy work?
Yeah, absolutely. Advocacy is more important than ever. I know we're tired. I know we're helping students directly. I know we're sorting that out, and this seems like the hardest work to pile on. But this is the time to really use that energy, use those student stories, and be advocates. This is op-eds about what's happening to your students. This is calls, visits if it's able, in your area, but calls, videos sent to your policymakers. It's important to say what's happening to your students. So, many think that the CARES Act passed and this emergency aid is there, but if it's not there in your community, it's important to talk to, your member of Congress about what this looks like at your local college or the experience of your students who have yet to receive their funding. It's important to talk about the implementation, and it's important to talk about what your hopes are coming up. I would just also add, particularly as community colleges, who are likely about to see significant changes in enrollment trends for this fall, with many, many more students looking to community colleges because they're local and because they're affordable. It's time to start telling your story. Talk about what you anticipate the fall will be. Talk about what your financial aid office is hearing about requests for professional judgment or appeals and changes in family circumstances. So I think arming your members with the information about what it looks like on the ground is important to shaping the policy you need. It's also important to have an ask, and we at NCAN are here to help with that ask. We'll be having a virtual advocacy week, July 20th, to double Pell, to restore its purchasing power, and to help students tackle affordability in a way where many are facing from this economic fallout and need dollars to do that. So storytelling, getting in touch with your elected officials, and joining in formal events on social media, on phone calls. We can do this even if it's virtually.
Tyler, you mentioned having student voices as part of your advocacy strategy. Can you chat with us a little bit more about the power of the voice of students in this advocacy space?
Yeah, I would love to, and thanks for asking that question. So actually, this week we just concluded the first ever Student Advocacy Fellowship program that Aspire has had. And so with that, we had 15 Student Advocacy Fellows, 5 from California, 5 from Massachusetts, and 5 from Pennsylvania. And the entire program was really to build their advocacy skills to advance equitable change in our higher education system by putting their experiences and their stories and their experiences in higher education first and foremost. And so last week we met with 43 legislators, and the entire meeting, I kid you not, was me introducing Aspire and then having students talk the entire time, and having them talk about this is what college is like for me, specifically around paying for indirect expenses, basic needs security, and then having a really fruitful discussion around this is what's happened since COVID-19 hit my campus, and this is what's happened since I've been home. I haven't received funding, or I have received funding, and so that was really powerful to see. It was more moving than any meeting that I could have with the legislator to tell them about here are our policy priorities and here are their asks, and just having an honest discussion about what's happening in the lives of students. And I don't think legislators hear that often enough. And they, almost every meeting, one said they appreciated, and 2 wanted us to come back, and wanted us to bring more students. And so to your question earlier, what can organizations, college access and service organizations do? I think it's to Kim's point, voicing your student stories, setting up meetings with legislators, because I think that's where the real work happens, is hearing what's happening on the ground and hearing what's happening to students, and crafting and shaping policies that are addressing the needs of what students need right now.
Laura, I know that TICAS does a lot of coalition work throughout the state, and I admire the work that you do as you kind of wrangle all of us together with a joint voice and message. Can you talk a little bit about the coalition work that TICAS is working on?
Yeah, happy to. So, as I mentioned, when we put this coalition together back in 2012, it was in response to the Great Recession, but we also wanted to provide a space where organizations for whom college affordability may not be their primary focus, but it does very substantially impact their constituents. We wanted a space for them to be able to participate in college affordability reforms. So, we work with the 3 statewide student leadership organizations for the UC, CSU, and the Cal States. We have civil rights organizations like the NAACP California and Unidos US. Business organizations like Bay Area Council, our great partners at Aspire and Ed Trust West and the Campaign for College Opportunity. And so, what we do, our coalition is active throughout the entire year, but it's really most active January through June, which is typically, we're in a strange year right now, but that's typically the budget season. And so for people who are participating, who are interested, please, feel free to reach out to me. I send out opportunities for advocacy. So those include, participating in hearings. You can do that remotely now, and providing public comment, reaching out to students that you know and that you work with, and having them provide public comment is critical. We also work on joint legislative letters, op-eds, as Kim had just mentioned, and we're also really trying to get the word out about our Join the Conversation, where students can submit their stories. And then what we're doing is we're trying to take those stories and put together social media tiles that we can then share with our partners to elevate on Twitter and Facebook. So those are the various ways that we are doing coalition work. And right now, because it's virtual, this distinction isn't as important, but during kind of normal times, we also really encourage advocacy both in Sacramento but also at the local level, going to district offices.
Thank you for that. So we're nearing we're going to start the official Q&A part of the program, and I wanted to invite folks to continue to submit their questions. A couple of the questions are around, as we all know, there's anticipated Daca Supreme Court decision, and one of the questions that came in through the Q&A is, what is the proportion of Daca students in the higher education system? We can parcel it out either. I know Kim might have some nationwide numbers, and 10,000 Degrees does have, we do serve undocumented students as well. I know you, I mean, we are all in this work and making sure that access to higher education is available to all students to unleash all of their potential of everyone. Kim, it sounds like you might do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can actually give you the California number because the community college suit did reference that. So this is a pretty fresh number. In that filing, the community college system estimated about 70,000 Daca students in California community colleges.
I'd also be happy to piggyback on that, my understanding is that there's around, I think 4,500 undocumented students at the UC and close to 10,000 at the CSU. Tyler, does that sound right?
It sounds right to me, but I would need to, I think, look it up just to verify.
Yeah, the Campaign for College Opportunity runs the California Undocumented Higher Education Coalition, which is a great coalition. And I'm just going off my memory of what they had on their site.
That sounds about right. And I think that, it's worthy to note that California is one of the few states that does provide funding for undocumented students. So I think many of us are in the work of making sure that that money continues to be there through this budgeting process to make sure that all students are able to access higher education. Let's see. So another question that came in, and I'm going to go back a little bit into our Pell conversation. Why is double the Pell? There was a comment around restoring the purchasing power of the Pell, and to restore it, we must double it. Can someone take on that question, and what is the rationale behind double the grant and double the Pell, and what is the purchasing power of the Pell?
I'm happy to jump in here. I'll try to make this very broad and not get wonky, but if somebody really wanted wonky, let me know and maybe we can connect offline. When the Pell Grant came about 40 years ago, the amount of the grant covered approximately 75% of the cost of college. Although there have been increases to the Pell Grant, the current Pell Grant only covers about 35% of the cost of college. So when we say restore the purchasing power, we want to get to a number that is similar to that 75% of cost that Pell covered when it was in its inception, and we would argue in its design and intent. So right now, to get to that number, it would have to double what the max Pell is now. There's also some numbers, if NCAN ran some numbers to get to restore it to 50% of purchasing power over the next 10 years. That number is roughly the same as doubling. Doubling is a little bit more straightforward and a better campaign than restore it to 50% in 10 years. So that's the thinking behind double, is to restore the purchasing power that it had at its creation, and what we would argue is the intent of the federal government to be a strong partner in college affordability.
Does anyone in the panel want to continue on that thread?
I think Kim covered it perfectly. Tyler, I don't know if you have anything.
I was going to agree with that too.
Great. One of the questions that came in is, how are cuts being thought of in terms of counties in the California state budget? The cuts are to higher ed institutions as a whole, and then they figure out what the cuts look like at a campus level. So there's just a question about what these higher education cuts would look like in a county like Sonoma or a county like Marin. Does anyone have any experience in those counties? Okay.
Have to look into it, yeah.
Yeah, so to that person, we'll make sure to follow up with you via email. Oh, Kim?
I don't have experience, but I want to tag on to the equity conversation we were having before that, this is probably an advocacy opportunity to talk about how those funds are allocated. We have a parallel conversation at the federal level when we talk about what's called campus-based aid, which is work study, SEOG, and how a big bucket of money is allocated among colleges. So at the federal level in this campus-based aid, there's a major weighing factor for how long you've been participating in the program. What's not in that allocation formula is, for example, the percentage of Pell students that you enroll. So I don't know anything about the intricacies of California, but when you dig in, if you find that there are not equity concerns like that, that is a real advocacy opportunity to suggest that allocation is made in an equitable way. Perhaps that looks first at percent of Pell Grant of recipients and enrollment at each institution.
Mm-hmm. One of the other questions that came up and is what are other benefits that students can tap into, and how can we connect students to these services? The person is referencing CalFresh, work study, and other opportunities for support beyond Cal and Pell Grants. Should I repeat the question?
I can jump in here real quickly too around this piece. And to your the question actually had said this, but a number of our students have mentioned over and over again just access to CalFresh benefits, or it's the state's SNAP program, right? So getting access to food assistance. And so a lot of our students, we talk a lot about how indirect expenses are paying for housing, food, transportation were already problems before COVID-19, and since then have been emphasized, and the equity gaps there have been widened. And so we talk a lot about what are ways that we can broaden access to programs like CalFresh. And a lot of our students have mentioned over and over again, just one, how complicated it is to apply for CalFresh. Two, the process to actually renew your CalFresh application. And then three, just how the dollars are given to you and when they're given to you. So those are definitely opportunities I think that we can start thinking through as well, as breaking down the silos outside of higher education, and then looking at the total amount of dollars that are available to students if we are able to make those programs more accessible to them.
I would also like to highlight, oh, sorry, Laura, you wanted to add something?
I'm just going to piggyback on that CDSS has a working group that's looking at CalFresh and getting it to low-income students. There's some complications in terms of eligibility criteria and whether you're a student or you're working. So I just wanted to flag that because there is ongoing work to bring CalFresh to more students, college students.
And you said that was CDSS?
Yes, the California Department of Social Services.
Got it. We'll make sure to include the resources that have been talked about in our post survey. So for our participants, keep an eye out for that. I did want to highlight one of the ways, and in regards to this question, is 10,000 Degrees does offer scholarships for students regardless of GPA. They have to be enrolled in a post-secondary institution. And I'd like to invite our president and CEO, Kim Azuka, to talk a little bit, if you're available, Kim, to chat a little bit about these scholarships that we provide to students throughout the Bay Area counties that we serve. So while she gets back on, I just wanted to give some background on that. We do provide scholarships. Oh, there she is.
Go ahead, Sbeydeh, I'll follow.
No, I just wanted to highlight the scholarship program that 10,000 Degrees has that helps students with the college affordability question and help them access college.
Great. Yeah, there really are two pieces to the financial assistance we provide. One is the direct cash assistance, the scholarships. So we do distribute approximately $4 million each year to right around 2,000 students. And our scholarships are renewable as long as they maintain educational progress. I think I mentioned that about 60% of our students are starting at the 4-year, 40% are starting at the 2-year, and we are anticipating that the 2-year number, that piece of the pie, is probably going to expand given COVID. But we do support all of our students as much as we can with that financial assistance, and it goes to the educational expenses of a student, which of course is tuition, fees, room and board, and so forth. The other large piece of work that we do around financial assistance is the financial aid management. We know that giving a scholarship is not going to increase the probability of their success. What is going to increase the probability is that we really reduce the loan burden. So our financial aid management support is we work with all of our students to make the college match, that college decision, so they can select a school that best fits them, but also taking into consideration what is the financial aid that they're receiving, from the Pell Grant to the Cal Grant to other institutional support, and so forth. And so that's why we're probably piecing together for every one of our students about $18,000 per year per student for at least up to 6 years right now of their college education. Last year, we leveraged about $22.5 million in free financial aid. So this is a large piece of our work. And I would say that also coupled with that, right, is student support, because if students don't know how to navigate their pathway, and right now they're dealing with mounting barriers, both, on campus or virtually, let's say, and also life off of campus, again, that financial assistance is not going to be helpful if it's not coupled with student support. So it really is that holistic support that is key, in addition to the financial aid.
Thank you, Kim. And that's such a great way to kind of package the advocacy work that we're all are doing, but also the support services that students need, the wraparound support services. And we have a couple more minutes in our session, and I wanted to close by asking the panelists a question. I would like to invite the panelists to think of themselves as policy meteorologists. If you were to predict the higher education policy weather, what would you say in your weather report? Although I'm not a panelist, I would like to kick it off to give you a little bit of time to think. So my weather report would be rains of all kinds, at times heavy, at times sparse, but make sure to get your umbrellas and get your raincoats because it's going to rain for a long time. So who would like to start your weather report, your closing weather report?
I'd be happy to.
Great.
So I guess I would say, well, it depends on what part of the country, but in California, I would say stormy with pockets of sunshine. There are still many unknowns, and we do have a pretty rough road ahead, but there have been instances that do give me great hope. So for example, the judgment today in California that, at least for now, CARES dollars can go to undocumented students. I don't know if schools will actually do that because it's still up in the air, but just the fact that there was that judgment, I think, is hopeful. And then also that Cal Grants have so far been protected in the state budget. Again, there are many things that we as a state need to do to protect students' aid and increase it. But in any case, I would say the stormy with some pockets of sunshine.
Great. Who would like to?
I can go next. I will say foggy with slight visibility. Foggy because there's a lot of unknown of what's happening in the future, and visibility because I think we know 3 things. In this time of uncertainty, 1, we need to amplify student voices. 2, we need to fight against the disinvestment from our higher education system. And 3, we need to double down on rectifying the inequities in our education system.
Thank you, Tyler. Kim Cook, what's your weather prediction coming all the way from DC?
Right. Federally, I think it is partly cloudy. I am heartened by the investment of the CARES Act, but I think we are challenged to not waste a crisis and to turn that kind of conversation into sustained investment in affordability for college.
Thank you, Kim. Kim Mazuga, would you like to add to the weather report?
Sure. I would suggest that this is an opportunity for incredible change. And I can't agree more with all the panelists. I think that we're looking at stormy times. I think we're looking at bright spots being threaded throughout. I do think that with the upcoming election, there's going to be some significant possible changes around policy in the Department of Education. And I think we need to be thinking about that. I think we need to be thinking about who's serving on our legislative bodies right now, because policy is the greatest lever for sustainable change. But here's the biggest, brightest spot of all, and it's our students. And so to the point that everybody has made around student voices, this is the time. I mean, we've seen what just incredibly powerful they are when they are out there sharing their students and their experiences. We need to really rally them as the most powerful force that this country has. So I look to all of our partners out there. I think of Kim, I think of all of our members, you know, as part of the National College Attainment Network. This is the opportune time to really rally our students and to push their voices forward and to amplify them for sustainable change. That is how we're going to create equity. So I just, on that note, I just want to thank each of our panelists today for the incredible work that you're doing to push these policies forward and all the support that you provide to our students. So thank you.
And thank you to our participants for the great questions. Please keep an eye out for the post survey. We will be continuing this series. If you have suggestions on town hall topics, town hall speakers, or panelists, please include that in your responses. We will be sending out a list of resources from the organizations that are here today with us. Laura, Tyler, Kim, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. To everyone at home and at work, thank you for joining us and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.